Black Scorpions, Black Fords, and Pancho Villa. With one less body in the car, we continued heading south toward Mazatlan. After an uneventful day of Mexican highway, we arrived in town just in time for the nightlife. Food was the first item of attraction on our list. Tacos from a street vendor were more exciting than they really had a good right to be. I had never seen tacos with cucumbers and radish before. Everything in the USA is covered with lettuce. Lucky for Rick and Bruce, they appeared to contain less rat feces than their North American counterparts, too. The worst thing that happened to our stomachs in Mexico was Rick trying to eat those chilies. We walked away from the taco cart, eating our dinner and watching rats scurry across the floor of the fish market. They would own the place until dawn, when the fishermen once again would fill the tables with their catch. We noticed two giggling girls watching us near the taco cart. Now that we were walking away down the street, they appeared to be tailing us. Two young Mexican women brushed by us on the sidewalk, and one reached out to pull on my mustache as she exclaimed, "Pancho Villa!" Joel was quick to let us know that we were being hit on. Duh. Then he gave us a short course, 101 for Mexican pickup lines. Me gusta las mujeres bonitas mexicanos, he said. I guess it meant beautiful Mexican women please me. I gave it a go, and the next time one of them went for my mustache, the result was extreme giggling and a rapid escape down an alley. Joel insisted that we follow them, but my time in Chicago, I had seen gypsy girls on Maxwell Street do the same thing. Down the alley would be her boyfriend with a big club and a hand ready for my wallet. Even though I had little in my wallet, I could really do without a concussion, so I kept walking through the warm coastal night. In what appeared to be a cross-cultural act of male bonding, Joel offered to buy us all tequila and led us to a bar of his liking. The place was the standard Mexican dive cantina, although cleaner than most I'd seen. It had two swinging cowboy-style doors, a ceiling fan that the flies chase around in a circle, and plenty of local working people. I have no idea how many glasses were filled, but it was plenty. Walking away and finding the Valiant was harder work than usual. Eventually, we decided that leaving town for the country and finding a place to sleep it off in the car was the plan. I'd been driving through the night, and though I was as drunk as the rest of my companions, once I got out of town, I just pulled the car over to the shoulder, grabbed my blanket, and passed out. I recall nothing until I heard snorting sounds in my left ear. I knew it couldn't be one of the girls that had pulled on my mustache the night before, so I slowly opened one bloodshot eye and looked left. "Holy shit!" was the only thing that I could think of to say. It was loud enough that I woke up the entire group. There was this nasty, mucus-covered snout grunting, snorting, and drooling all over the window by my ear. "It was a frickin' wild boar," I yelled. At least, it had most of the breeding of one. It must have actually lived on a farm, because there was a little boy with a stick beating the beast on the ass to drive it at me. Behind him was his father, who was probably the brains of this excellent practical joke. I guess the moral of the story might be, if you don't take the women, then you'll end up with the pig, and no matter what, you're going to get a hell of a hangover. From Mazatlan to Guadalajara is an awesome drive. Jungle was evident in the beginning. We set our watches to tarantulas scurrying across the road, and the air was filled with brightly colored parrots. The best cup of coffee I ever drank in Mexico was served up in a questionable-looking dirt floor road stop somewhere outside of Mazatlan. The look of the place lacked sanitation of the other road stops, but we figured that coffee is boiled, so it should be safe. We were pleasantly surprised, and it was many years before I had another cup of joe that was that good. Across the road from our coffee shack was a field of green, grassy-looking stuff that Rick and I guessed might be sugar cane. We asked Howell about it, and he confirmed our suspicions. He also warned us that it was dangerous to steal farmers' crops. Our sweet tooth overcame our honesty, and we jumped the fence and stole the stalk of sugar cane from the field despite Howell's vigorous protests. Sugar cane and coffee eventually gave way to drier country with large cacti. We'd been in the country most of the drive through Mexico and had only seen a few cities so far. None of them were very large, and entering Guadalajara was a shock. There were people and vehicles everywhere. It didn't seem to matter what sort of vehicle. Burro carts, motorbikes, semi-trucks, they were all on the road together. Which direction a vehicle was pointing didn't seem to matter either. A man with an ox cart might be flowing at 90 degrees to the traffic direction. People were streaming in all directions through the traffic. I'd seen pictures of traffic in India that seemed worse, but from my personal experience, this was the worst I had ever seen. Chicago is an easy country drive compared to Guadalajara. For three Midwestern boys, this town seemed like a carnival sideshow full of first-time experiences. Even Chicago's Maxwell Street, the Casbah of the Midwest, seemed tame compared to the urban chaos outside our car windows. Traffic was slow enough to make the drive seem more like a sightseeing tour. We watched men shopping for whores in the red light district. There were so many women lined up selling services that it took special gimmicks to even be noticed from the crowd. One lady had figured out how to get attention from several clients. She appeared to be discussing price and service rendered with several men who watched her stroking a huge black scorpion as it walked across her large, half-exposed breasts. I'm still wondering what the scorpion does while she's working her johns. Probably the strangest sight was the guy with the black Ford. The streets were filled. Finding parking on the main drag was not an easy thing to do. This imposing-looking fellow in a jet black 1965 Ford sedan pulls up next to us as we waited for a traffic light. He sizes up the parking spot that is only about 50% large enough to hold his car. He puts the car in park, gets out of the... physically inspects the spot while walking around in it and looking at the cars parked down the block. He makes a decision, gets back into his car. He puts the car into reverse and proceeds to ram the car behind him hard enough that it hits the next car, and so on, until he actually moved the entire block's worth of autos, leaving zero clearance between any of the parked cars. This maneuver gives him just enough room to wedge his car into the space. Next, he gets out, pockets the keys, and heads off down the street, as if this maneuver is just business as usual. The only reason that he could even try this is because the Ford was one of them old-time cars with a solid steel frame underneath and probably a 390 V8 under the hood. A modern car would have folded up like an accordion, set off every alarm on the block, and before discharging the airbags and trapping him inside the car. I also assumed he must be well known as a dangerous man, because it would be clear to everyone trying to move their cars that this black Ford had created the problem. The light turned green, and we had to leave before I got a chance to see any of the drivers whose cars were packed together using the same maneuver to try to extract themselves. Just when we thought we had seen everything Guadalajara had to offer, we entered the Roman Circle of Death. I was aware from my history classes that the Romans always built roads that met at circles in the middle of town. The center of the circle usually had a statue of some senator or such. I've seen these circles in books and in movies, but I had never had the opportunity to drive in one. This type of street layout is also common in Europe, and Probably worked well back in the days when the roads were used mostly by feet, chariots, and horses, and I am sure it worked well until the automobile was invented. We had no choice but to flow with the traffic and enter the circle with no clear idea of which one of the roads takes us out of town. Rick was at the wheel and didn't read in Spanish worth a darn, so the signs were just about useless. Somehow we ended up on the inside ring of the circle, and there was no way out. We ended up going around and around and around, surrounded by speeding trucks, trying to find our road while racing for a lane change in the Mexican 500. We must have driven around that statue about 20 times with Howell pointing and yelling before we got to the outside ring and found our road. Finally, the freedom of the open road was ours, and we left town thanking the universe for our survival. Irapuato. Continuing south from Guadalajara through Mexico, we had stuck with our commitment to drive Howell home. Following his directions, we eventually ended up at Irapuato, in a state where the license plates were all marked GTO. It turned out that Howell was afraid of his wife in Michoacan. Bringing 3 dirty guitar-playing hippies from the north wasn't the best homecoming present. Instead, he decided that we would end up at his folks' house in Irapuato. We were treated as honored guests. It isn't every day that 3 Americans bring their son home non-stop. Being flexible, we rolled with the situation and took advantage of the hospitality and the first shower I had seen in quite a while. It was February, and everybody still seemed to be celebrating Christmas. Don't these people ever quit? I'm familiar with people who don't take down their Christmas tree until Labor Day, but here they were still having parties. We were invited to one and became the center of attraction. Shots of some dark liqueur were passed around, and a plastic doll dressed as the Christ child got a kiss from everyone in the room. If I wanted to share that much saliva, I would have just kissed all the women in the room, honest. Creedence Clearwater Revival in Spanish was playing on the phonograph. Howell pushed us to dance with his girl cousins and told us to try to make time with them. I think Rick found the only girl in the room who was less than 200 pounds, unmarried, and legal age. I danced with the little girls in order to get Howell off my back. Howell's mom kept our stomachs filled with beans and tortillas. If I'd had any salt, I might have used some. The beans were unseasoned and pretty bland, but they kept us from going hungry. One day we had what Americans would call a sandwich steak, and it was a pretty big deal for them. After weeks of beans, I had to agree, this little piece of beef was very special. Another time she made us some kind of soup. It tasted fine, but it had these little crunchy critters in it. In a form of wishful thinking, I decided they must be dried shrimp. It is quite possible that that is truly what they were. I don't think whole dried shrimp are all that great, but they beat the alternatives like some kind of pond bug or worse, or maybe a roach that fell into the pot. The sheer quantity of them in the soup kind of made the roach idea unlikely. I tried not to pay too much attention to what I was eating and focused on the fact that I was hungry. One evening, Howell invited his cousins Salvador and Lopez over to play music with us. They were quite good at traditional Mexican music. They both sang, and Salvador played a fair guitar. We swapped songs with them. They would play Mexican folk, and we would play American folk music, and even some American rock and roll. We did a rousing session of Chicago blues with Bruce playing his harmonica as Rick and I picked guitar. Once it appeared that things were going well, Howell called out for tequila. At this particular moment in time, drinking tequila was new to me. Today it is a very popular drink on both sides of the border, but in those days, that was rare stuff in the Midwest. Joel's mom came in with a jumbo bottle of Jose Cuervo surrounded by limes, salt, and glasses. I was so new to this that Joel had to show me how to lick the back of my left hand, shake the salt on the wet spot before lifting the lime in the left and then slamming the tequila with the right. Down went the tequila with a shudder. Next, licked the salt and then sucked the lime. It was fun, and we inserted tequila drinking in between our songs. I had no idea how long this party kept going, but we finished that jumbo bottle of tequila off. Had to send out for another. We'd all become brothers and eventually said our goodbyes. I recall the three of us tossed sleeping bags on a concrete floor and lay down. Our conversation before sleep was about how amazing the tequila drunk was. We all figured with that amount of booze that we'd consume, walking around and talking should be impossible. We were still mobile, and therein lays the danger of tequila. Since you can still walk around after drinking a quart, then you can also eat the top off a wooden bar with your teeth, dance on a table, or ride a Brahma bull. The next morning I woke to the sound of giants in the street and vintage biplanes circling my head. Giants turned out to be children playing outside the door, and the biplanes were actually flies buzzing around my head. Everyone else woke up in pretty much the same condition. The classic hangover was the other discovery we made about tequila. That day was spent in the local cantina nursing hangovers with Coca-Cola. The barroom hooker looked a bit miffed over the fact that such handsome boys had no interest in her services on that particular day. Howell kept telling us that he could get us a job playing music in clubs around town. We kept looking at the pitiful fistful of U.S. dollars we had left to our name and started thinking about heading home. The hangover was talking, I'm sure, but the money shortage was real, and the specter of playing guitar for tacos in Mexican barrooms was not appealing. He wasn't happy about our request, but he had promised to find some grass for us. He took us to an arroyo outside of town and told us to sit and wait. If it wasn't for the trust I had in him, I would have thought for sure we were about to be rolled. Eventually, a purple-painted VW showed up with 4 fairly slick-looking locals inside. I can only describe them as Mexican hippies. They had on dark glasses, and they were playing Hendrix in the tape deck. They sold us a double fistful of grass that was all neatly rolled up in newspaper. It looked like a giant joint. I wondered if the local custom was to just light one end and enjoy. The guys we bought it from sure looked like they'd smoked plenty of the stuff that day. We got out some papers, sat down on the stream bank and rolled a fat one, and got so wasted. We had no idea. Being used to the Mexican grass in the States, we figured this would be similar. We were wrong. The stuff was killer. We could barely make it back into town. We made the mistake of sharing some with Howell, who went into the massive Mexican paranoia after just a few tokes. That evening, we packed our stuff, got a good night's sleep, and tried to get out of town in the morning before anybody could stop us. The hospitality had been wonderful, and we thanked the family for everything, but the truth is, they really didn't want us to leave. We almost had to push our way out of town, and Howell, he looked the saddest of all. I guess we are one of the most exciting things that had happened in their lives for a while. All good things come to an end eventually. None of us get out of here alive, and besides that, life will destroy your complexion if it takes too long to die. Off we went through the desert, heading for Tucson, where the rolls hit the road. The journey from Irapuato out to the coast crosses over some pretty high terrain. On one particular evening, I got my first lesson in boiling water at high elevation. We had located a level spot off the highway and made a camp for the evening. As always, I was chief cook. I held this job not because I'd drawn the short straw, but because I did not want Rick or Bruce to burn my dinner. The food store in our trunk turned out to be getting low, and so was the cash in our pockets. We did the math, decided that we had enough food, but our money would only take us out of Mexico and back to Arizona if we were careful. We figured that the only luxuries we could afford were Mexican cigarettes and a cup of coffee each morning for breakfast. Our budget meant that I would cook some of the food that we had been avoiding in our trunk. Boxes of Kraft spaghetti dinners were on the menu. To cook these meant we had to boil water. We had cans of Sterno in our camping stuff, so instead of gathering wood, I lit one of these cans and put a pot of water on top of it. I had no idea how long it takes a pot of cold water to boil over Sterno at 8,000 foot elevation. Turned out it takes a real long time. Darkness was approaching when the first bubbles started to rise in the water. Of course, at high elevation, the bubbles rise early, before the water is actually hot enough to cook the noodles. Ignorance is bliss, so I dumped the noodles in the water and hoped for the best. Well, sometimes the best isn't good enough. Everybody was tired and hungry. Plus, it was getting dark. I think Bruce was starting to see pizzas running around through the shrubs. He started dreaming about hard rolls to go with the spaghetti. He began to describe them in detail, and he finally came right out and declared that he just couldn't eat spaghetti without rolls. I'm about ready to ask him to watch the pot to take his mind off the rolls when Rick tries to talk sense into his head. He tells Bruce that the next town where the rolls might be found is an hour away, and it's dark, so all the stores are closed anyway. Not to mention we have no money for luxuries like rolls. Bruce, he's hearing none of this. He insists he must have rolls. The two are starting to get on my nerves, but just then I'm saved by the pasta getting soft. I pile some on my plate and tell Bruce that he's welcome to walk back down the mountain for rolls, but Rick and I'll be staying here to eat up the spaghetti. Bruce eventually ate his spaghetti without the rolls, but I could hear him grumbling to himself all night long. The next morning, we drove until we hit the edge of a village and found a truck stop. It had been agreed that we could afford coffee in the morning, so I was prepared to enjoy one of my few daily luxuries. The place was clean, bright, and the waitress refilled our cups for us several times. What more could I ask for? Ever since a dog had thrown up on Bruce's shoes back in Irapuato, he'd been showing signs of Mexican burnout, but this morning it was coming to a head. He was still hung up on rolls and refused to let it go. On top the counter was one of those plastic cake boxes that restaurants keep donuts and Danish in. It contained a good pile of cinnamon rolls with white frosting and raisins. Bruce turns to it and declares he could grab the rolls and make it out of the restaurant before anybody could stop him. Rick and I put our foot down on this with a firm no. This is more than either of us can put up with. Bruce is allowing his desires to jeopardize all of us, and this is a completely uncool behavior. I turn to him and tell him straight to his face, he is not in Chicago anymore. This is Mexico, and if you get caught, you will rot in a stinking cell full of cockroaches until someone figures out how to buy your way out or not. I assure him that he will get no help from us. If he grabs those rolls and heads out the door, he had better keep running, because we are not going to use the car to help him escape. Rick agrees and tells Bruce to just get over it and gets up to leave before anything else happens. Bruce feels that he's been ganged up on him again. but I just can't see what else to do. The boy just isn't thinking straight. He's got the Mexican burnout and the dog puked on my shoes breakdown blues, for sure. We continue driving till around midday. We find ourselves up in the mountains again. The air is nice, sun is shining, so we decide to take a break, look around for a nice spot to pull over. We find a spot that was large enough where there's a flat graded area beside the road and decided to play some frisbee for a while. Our frisbee began doubling as a glove compartment several detours back. The Mexican detours have been pretty rough on the old Valiant. Our car had been losing bits and pieces with every one that we had to navigate. During one of these overland journeys, the glove compartment had just given up and fell out of the dash under my feet. Since it was the only decent place we had to store papers like visas and auto registration, we had to improvise. It was decided that the frisbee would now hold our papers, and we pinned it under the passenger side visor for safekeeping. As we get out of the car and grab the frisbee, I remove the papers and set them down on the passenger seat. We tried for quite a while to play a three-way game, but the freak wind currents on the mountain kept pulling the frisbee this way and that. It was almost impossible to play a game because of the unpredictable action of the disc. We gave up, decided to get back on the road. I collected the papers, placed them inside the frisbee, and secured it under my visor. As we pulled back on the road, another one of those gusts blew up, hit the open window on my side of the car. The visor came down as the frisbee flew out of the window and then danced along the highway, spreading our papers everywhere it went. I'm yelling to Rick, "Stop the car! Stop the car!" I recall thinking that we will never get out of this place if we lose those papers. I hit the road running before the car even stops moving. I'm running down the road in a panic, chasing paper. The sheets seem to stay just one step ahead of me, as if pulled by some unseen hand. As I bend over to collect the last paper, I heard a vehicle coming down the road. I look up to make sure that I'm safe, and my eyes fall on the bright paint of a Bimbo bread truck. It's rolling past us on the other side of the road. As I look down to be sure I have all the papers, an object hits the pavement at my feet. I cannot believe my eyes, and I stand there completely stunned as Rick comes running up behind me. There on the road, laying face up and undamaged, is an entire package of cinnamon rolls with white frosting and raisins. They were the exact rolls that Bruce had been planning to steal at the truck stop in the morning. Both Rick and I are almost afraid to pick up the package. It is just a little too much for our puny minds to embrace. After days of fighting over rolls, the identical rolls that were an issue in the morning are now at our feet, free for the taking. I lift the package off the pavement and head back to the car, carrying it as if it was the Immaculate Conception. As we walked, Rick and I grilled each other over what we had just seen. Neither of us had seen a window or a truck door open. We saw no arm tossing the rolls. All we saw was a truck that was closed up and a package hit the pavement out of nowhere as it passed. It was the manna of the Israelites. It fell from heaven at our feet. As we got into the car, I set the rolls on the seat, and we all just kind of stared at them, unable to say anything or even touch them. To this day, I swear the package had a kind of golden light around it, like the Passion of Christ. Eventually, the light faded, and we all agreed that it was there for us to eat, and eat we did. We enjoyed every last crumb and bit of frosting. Now let's face facts. Bimbo rolls are no big deal. They are sort of like Mexican Wonder Bread. It wasn't the rolls that were so amazing. It was their appearance on a mountain road that made them so fine. Some people see the Virgin in a loaf of bread. We get cinnamon rolls. Miracles do happen, and good things come to those who wait long enough. That night I pulled the Valiant over to the roadside and prepared to take some sleep. It was a mutual decision that smoking a bomber before bed was called for. After getting a head full of reefer, I got out of the car to take a leak. We were way up in the mountains again. The air was cool and the stars looked like diamonds cast on black velvet. There seemed to be so many, more than I had remembered. I hunted among them for a familiar pattern, and soon I spotted Scorpio. Because we were below the Tropic of Cancer, Scorpio was higher in the sky than I had ever seen it before. It was so bright. As I stared into space, all of the stars in the universe seemed as if they came streaming out of the stinger at the end of Scorpio's tail. It was amazing. I started to mutter to myself as I got back in the car. Rick and Bruce were wondering what I'd been doing outside. I just couldn't get it out. I do not recall what I said to them, but over 40 years later, I am still grinning about it. And Scorpio has never looked that grand again.